Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. Most of us, myself included, thankfully, do something all day, every day that we don't think much about. We see. Since I was 7, I have worn glasses, and just recently I got a new pair. They are trifocal, which means they combine 3 different levels of magnification seamlessly in what is a not too thick lens that allows me to accurately and clearly view my world. My need for these glasses and their increased magnification is rapidly becoming an annual event because as we age, most of us notice that our eyes, I suppose, are aging right along with us. Maybe that is one of the reasons that as I grow older, I want to be able to see more inside myself. And frankly, see inside other people more and more. See what matters. I want to see what's at the heart of a person. What is the essence of a conundrum? Or what is the core of my current challenge? I want to see everything, always, in the words of St. Paul, with the eyes of my heart enlightened. Today, my guest is the author Brittany Muller, and her book, The Contemplative Tarot, A Christian Guide to the Cards, is what prompted me to reach out and invite her for a conversation to open up my way of seeing. Her book helped me, it gave me permission of sorts to do something I was already doing, but to do it with a little less guilt. Now, if you are a contemplative person, or if you're somebody who just wants to bring more contemplative practices into your life, well, my friend, her book might be just the unorthodox catalyst that you need. Now, tarot cards have a witchy and mysterious connotation for most of us. I certainly surprised myself when I bought my first deck, but I quickly fell into an effortless practice of utilizing the cards to see something in a new way about myself or a current situation. And the cards themselves, well, they're wonderful to behold. They're beautiful and a sort of symbolic game of I spy when I am sometimes stuck or when I don't know where to start in my prayer time. I'll just pull a card and take some time to be with it. And just doing that can prompt a whole new perspective, a new way of seeing. It was such a treat to have this conversation, and I'm grateful and delighted that Brittany took the time to talk with me and to share quite personally about her own spiritual discernment, the back and forth that many of us go through when we are wanting to find that place where we will truly be seen for who we are. So, if you don't know anything about tarot cards and are worried, just like I used to be, that you are practicing heresy just by listening to this, well, I hope you'll check this out. And if you're curious about the book or tarot, I put all the information in the show notes. But mostly, as always, I hope this conversation opens up some new ways of seeing for you, and that the eyes of your heart might be just a bit more enlightened for it. Thanks for listening. Hello there, Brittany Muller.
Hello, good morning.
It is really great to see you. I'm thrilled to have you on Feeling Beings Who Think. I'm thrilled that you're drinking from the Metropolitan Museum of Art mug, as that is a museum that is close to my heart as a New Yorker. But you're in Austin, Texas, correct?
I am. I lived in New York for 4 years, but I am a native Austinite, and I am back here now with my family, and it's great. I do miss New York a lot, but I feel very at home here in Austin.
Austin is, I've been there once for a weekend. It's a very eclectic, fun, keep it weird is the phrase, correct, for Austin?
Yes. Yes. But yeah, I love it. It's a great place to raise kids. It's much more laid back than New York, you know.
Every place is more laid back than New York.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, keep it weird. I think that's a great way to sort of think about what I want to talk about with you. You are the author of a book that is pretty recently close to my heart called The Contemplative Tarot. And you're also a writer. And as you said, you're a mom and native Texan. And I want to talk with you about this book. And I want to preface it a little bit by saying, I'm nervous, and I shared this with you before, I'm nervous to even start this conversation because I need to admit, and I feel it's somewhat confessional, that I have been utilizing tarot cards in my prayer practice for about 2.5 years. I thought I was being just frankly totally heretical. I didn't really talk about it with anybody in the church. And then through me exploring some of the offerings at the Church of the Heavenly Rest website in a church in Manhattan, I found an interview with you because you had been a parishioner there and you had just recently launched this book. And also I found you on Instagram the day that I made an Instagram account for Feeling Being Soothing. And I requested to follow you. And that same day you wrote a post saying you were taking a break from Instagram.
Oh no. I will be back on Instagram at some point.
It gets a little overwhelming, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And I just had a baby in mid-October.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I wanted, this is baby number 3 for me, and I just wanted like a little break from like social media during this postpartum time. But I will be back. I do miss Instagram. I didn't think I would miss it, but I do miss it.
Well, absence makes the heart grow fonder, as they say.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So I want to dive in to this book and in the course of this conversation, let people know what tarot is if they're not familiar with it. You write in the book about how tarot and Christianity are a natural pairing. I agree with that. I want to hear more from you about that. But let's start from this sentence or a couple sentences you wrote at the beginning in the introduction. And you're talking about what led you to purchase a tarot card deck. And you said, I bought it because I missed the intentionality of prayer. I bought it because I was trying to cultivate meaning. Tarot scratched my itch for the ritual of religion, and I quickly fell in love with how it made me feel seen. That's a beautiful sentence, and I would love you to expound a little bit on it.
Sure. Yeah. So I came to tarot during a time in which I was not a part of a church or really interested in organized religion at all. My family is Catholic, but I had a crisis of faith in college, and I left Catholicism and Christianity in general for a while. But I did really miss sort of the intentionality of religion and the ritual of religion, because I don't think it's possible to grow up in a really religious home and then leave the faith and not miss certain things about it, because it's about faith, but it's also about the culture of upbringing and one's family. So I left Christianity, but was really looking for things that could bring some sense of ritual and contemplation into my life. And I lived in Austin at the time and had friends who played around with tarot decks, because Austin is kind of a witchy, new agey, I guess, kind of place. So I had friends who played around with tarot decks, and I loved the art of the tarot. I thought it was really beautiful. I thought, this seems really cool. So I bought a deck and fell in love with it. I never used it for divination because that was never something I was particularly interested in.
Can you say what divination is? I'm not sure that everybody knows what that means.
Yeah. So tarot is sort of, in pop culture, it's most often used for divination or like fortune telling. So you pull cards and you try to divine the future, to tell the future through what you see in the cards and the meaning of the cards. I never really used it that way, but I really loved pulling a card or two every day and sort of sitting with it. I would do this like early in the morning before my kids woke up. I would sort of sit with a card and drink my coffee and think about it and think about how it related to my interior life. And sometimes I would journal about it. And for me, tarot sort of created a space for me to come back to my like spiritual life and my interior life, which is something that I really missed after leaving religion. I think that's one of tarot's great gifts. It really can be a contemplative tool, I think.
I'm curious in particular about how pulling a tarot card can make you feel seen. I mean, I have some ideas about that personally, but I want to hear what yours are.
Yeah. So when I came to tarot, I haven't talked about this a whole lot because I feel like people are less interested in like motherhood and how like my experience as a mom has sort of intersected with experience of tarot. But I came to tarot when my kids I had two kids at the time, and they were 1.5-ish and 6 months old. So I had two under two. My husband was in law school at the time, so I didn't really have a lot of time to myself. And I think it's really easy in sort of caring for young children to sort of lose your sense of self because you're always like focused outward and always giving to your children. Tarot was really helpful in that it was the first thing that gave me a sense of being able to come back to myself after having children. And so when I would pull a card, it would help me feel like I had space to look at myself, and it sort of gave me permission to sit with my feelings and take time for myself. And for me, I always saw myself in the card. Like I would pull the Empress, which is a card that's traditionally associated with motherhood. And so I would think about like my role as a mother in my life, or I would pull the Page of Wands, which is fiery, energetic, curious figure. And I would be able to think, I see this in my life. Where do I see this in myself? Where do I see this kind of personality? Like maybe in my children or in my friends or my family. And it gave me a lens to, I don't know, sort of examine my life in a different way, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes complete sense. I mean, that's one of the reasons I have this podcast.
Yeah.
This podcast is in place for intentional conversation in the same way that I think of an intentionality around prayer. And what you're describing is utilizing something as a gateway to see into your soul.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to put it.
Maybe that's one of the reasons I resonated so much with how you structured your book and utilize it as a way in which people can incorporate tarot. I would almost call it a transitional object. Do you know that phrase?
No, I don't.
It comes from D.W. Winnicott. And the easiest way to think of it is Linus's blanket from the Peanuts cartoon. You know how Linus always carries that blanket?
Yeah.
Right. So, and as a mom, I don't know if your children have a blanket or a binky or something that is their object that they must have. Because it's that transitional object between feeling like they're completely a part of who you are and growing into the world as a separate self. But we need something to hold on to.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
I too grew up in a very Roman Catholic household with a lot of ritual and tchotchkes and ways in which we externalized the intentionality of prayer. And to me, those are transitional objects that I still need in different forms. And so that's one of the ways in which I find tarot to be useful.
Yeah, I love the idea of externalizing the intentionality of prayer. Exactly what tarot feels like for me. And it's always interesting to me when people get sort of weird about tarot, especially fellow Catholics, because I do feel like Catholicism is a very like physical religion. They're all about externalizing prayer and visual beauty. And I think tarot slots very well into that whole idea.
Can you talk a little bit about that idea that people get scared to talk about something, or people feel defensive? People feel worried that you're doing something wrong, when it comes to religion or God. I can relate to that from my own past when I used to think a little more dualistically about all of these things. And now I don't feel that way. And I'm very open to new ways of connecting with divinity or holiness. So how have you shifted in that? Or did you, or did you have some of that trepidation when you were first like, is this really something I can legitimately call contemplative prayer?
Yeah, I definitely did. Yeah, I mean, I grew up, in a Catholic home where I was told that things like tarot or, astrology or anything like that, any sort of new age practice was very, not just like wrong, but dangerous. There was this idea that using these tools, you were inviting evil into your life. And it was a very superstitious idea that something like a tarot deck, like the physical object, held some measure of evil. And it didn't matter how you used it. It was just like a dangerous thing to have in your home or anywhere around you. Like you just didn't want to mess with it. And so when I started playing around with tarot, there was a little bit of hesitation just because, I was told that it was a dangerous thing. But in practicing tarot and playing around with it and in becoming more familiar with the deck itself and with the images in the cards, and especially with the history of tarot, I don't know, it was fascinating because there's a lot of very traditional Christian imagery in the tarot deck. And the tarot deck itself comes from a very Christian culture. And so it has been used for divination, for new age or like occult purposes, but it doesn't have to be used that way. It really well fitted into Christian ideas, contemplation, if people can sort of move past pop culture ideas about tarot.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more, because I really enjoyed reading more of that in your book, the history of tarot and how, it was really just this card game, and it happened in this place that has a culture of Roman Catholicism, or just basically Catholicism, that's hard for you and I to imagine because it's so far removed from the world we live in and pluralistic religions everywhere. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then what happened in the 19th century in France?
Yeah. So tarot originated in Renaissance Italy. And like you said, it was originally a card game. It wasn't created to be used for fortune telling or for any sort of occult purposes. Renaissance Italy, everyone was Catholic. I think now, like in the culture we live in now, Christianity is often seen as like a lifestyle choice. That just is not the case in Renaissance Italy. Like everyone was Catholic, and you either liked being Catholic or you didn't like being Catholic. It was what it was. I feel like it was something that really had to be reckoned with if you were, an artist or a philosopher or anything like that. I see that come through in the tarot. And these days, people who play around with tarot don't often engage with religious imagery in the cards, but it's definitely there. Like it really did come out of a very Christian culture. And it sort of floated around Europe as a card game for like 300 years before it had any occult associations. And as you said, it was in the 19th century in France. There was a big occult revival in France. For some time in France during that time, people were into fortune telling and stuff like that, secret societies. And it was during this time that tarot sort of became associated with all of that stuff. But it was only hundreds of years after its creation. And for me, that made me feel better about using tarot, to know that while it has occult associations, it doesn't have occult origins.
Yeah. And, when you look at that deck of cards, there's a lot of imagery in there, as you point out, and your different reflections on them, that's very Christian.
I mean, you see like cardinal virtues like justice and temperance, and you see Christian figures. The Hierophant was originally, he's called the Hierophant now, but he was originally the Pope. There's a hermit card. There are images in churches and stuff like that.
There's images of chalices and patens and the dove. I mean, there's so many images.
Once you start noticing it, you sort of notice it everywhere.
I think it's so interesting because, religion in general, there's always an aspect of superstition connected to it. If you look at Christian history, part of like the Protestant Reformation is trying to sort of, reject aspects of that in Catholicism. And yet we all develop our own ways in which we do certain things, thinking that it's going to affect the outcome of our lives or have some sort of effect. The way in which utilizing tarot in a contemplative way to make time to get in touch with your interior world is one of the ways in which it's so obviously connected with the way in which we pray. or hope to pray. Most of us long for, how do I do that? How do I turn my mind off and sit still and be quiet and pay attention to what's going on with me? And we need, objects that help us do that. So this came out of Roman Catholicism, and you grew up in this very Roman Catholic household and then left it, as many of us do, and then found another church in a different faith that was kind of, Episcopal is pretty close to Roman Catholicism. I bristle at the term, but people say Catholic light. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the sort of back and forth movement of that in your life?
Yeah, I grew up in a Catholic home and left for a long time. My husband and kids and I wound up going to an Episcopal church during the time we lived in New York. So I'm a native Austinite, but we spent 4 years in New York because of my husband's job, and then moved back to Austin. And my husband was actually the one who sort of prompted us to start going back to church. We were living in New York. We were really looking for community. And my husband had also grown up in a Christian home. He grew up Presbyterian. Church was something that he really missed, a lot more than I missed it, to be honest. So he sort of prompted us to go back to church. And part of the reason we wound up at an Episcopal church is because I grew up Catholic and my husband grew up Presbyterian. And the Episcopal church was sort of a good middle ground for us. It had the ritual of Catholicism that I really loved, but the Protestantism that my husband really loved. It worked out really well for us. And the church we wound up at, Church of the Heavenly Rest on the Upper East Side, was just an incredible church. It is an incredible church. I miss it so much. It was really welcoming. It was great for our kids. And for me, it was the place where I really sort of came back to my faith. It holds a really special place in my heart.
And yet you didn't stick with it.
I didn't stick with it. I am Catholic again now, and my husband converted as well. So we're raising our kids Catholic. So I was in the Episcopal church for 3 years. And then when we moved back to Austin, we were, looking for a church home. And I had felt more and more in the last few years like I was really missing Catholicism. I've done so many podcast interviews for this book, and I think you're the first person to really ask about this.
Oh, well,
so hopefully I can
I'm very interested for a number of reasons, but keep going, and I'll say more.
Hopefully I can sort of explain this coherently. It's the faith of my family. And so I've always felt sort of culturally Catholic. It was something that I missed so much. I really wrestled with it for a long time. My husband can attest to this. He got so annoyed by the back and forth constantly of wow, I really miss being Catholic, but I can't be Catholic again. Because the reason I left Catholicism is because, well, there were a lot of reasons, but I really struggled with the church's stance on gay marriage. I really struggled with the church's stance on birth control and abortion. And I felt like I just really don't agree with the church on these things. I don't know how to go back to Catholicism when I have so many deep disagreements with the church, but also I can't stop thinking about being Catholic again. It felt like it was really pulling me back so much. And eventually I got to the point where, the Catholic Church is my home. It's my faith. I have a lot of disagreements about it. I hate how conservative the American Catholic Church is. But if I leave the Catholic Church and I don't ever go back, then I feel like I'm leaving my faith to people I really disagree with. And it's what if I was Catholic, had a voice as a Catholic inside the church about these issues, and modeled a more progressive Catholicism? And something that really helped me was meeting and becoming friends with more progressive Catholics. And I felt maybe I can do this. Maybe I can be a part of the church that feels like my home, as messy as it is, and also feel like I can still sort of follow my conscience about these issues. And so I got to the point where I felt like I could do that. And it still doesn't feel entirely comfortable, but I I am more at peace in the Catholic Church.
In my experience with the Roman Catholic Church in the Southwest and the South, is that it's much more akin to the community you feel in Protestant churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and then that's not really true, I find, of Roman Catholic churches in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, much more conservative. I just, this might be a completely selfish endeavor, but for some reason, I think other people might be interested in that topic of the going back and forth, because, you're talking about something that I think so many of us long for, which is, where do I go when I want to find a sense of meaning and purpose in my life that's bigger than just me and my story, and connect with some feeling of promise and hope? People tend to do that in church, and these days that's not a place that people look to, and it's certainly not a part of the world we live in as just the given, as that's where you go. And people have a much more of this ability to pick and choose. And we wrestle with like this perfect place, and, the Roman Catholic Church, I left it for the reasons that you're describing, and find in the Episcopal Church, there's plenty of other things for me to be frustrated about, right? There's just kind of like no perfect place. And I think it's so important that you name just how foundational our upbringing is in this endeavor.
Yeah, for me, it was so important.
There's just something about the way in which that's imprinted on us at an early age.
Yeah, I mean, I've known so many people who have left the faith for perfectly valid reasons and don't want to go back, and I totally understand that. But I think there's also something to be said for sort of sticking with the faith that you grew up in, or the faith that and finding good in that. But I also spent 10 years outside of Catholicism. I'm sort of interested in New Age practices. I had a couple of years where I was also like really interested in Buddhism. I was Episcopalian for a few years, and I sort of like hopped around and explored all of these things. And eventually it felt like I'm looking for the perfect place. I'm looking for all of the things that I can find in Catholicism without the stuff that frustrates me about Catholicism. But like you said, there are frustrations everywhere, and there is no perfect place. And I think there's something to be said for like finding a church home and sticking with it.
And, while you were talking, it occurred to me that Church of the Heavenly Rest, I don't know if it still is, but at one time was also the congregation of Elaine Pagels, who wrote the Gnostic Gospels and is sort of well known.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And she really brought into secular culture, really, this idea that there are more Gospels than the canonized versions we have in the Bible. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all these really rich texts and teachings. And that's a whole separate history. I won't go down that, but I just think it's great that Church of the Heavenly Rest, which is probably one of the traditionally most Protestant churches you'll find in New York, birthed two of you that open up a world of contemplative, esoteric teaching in Christianity. Yeah, so that's where I wanted to go next, was around the contemplative practices, because I actually think that's why sometimes people move from an Episcopal church or a more Protestant church towards Roman Catholicism or towards Buddhism, because there is an emphasis on contemplative and making space inside oneself to be present to the holy. And Protestant churches in particular can get we do a lot, and we love community, and we love getting together and hospitality and fellowship. And so there's a lot of talking. One of the ways in which you talk about utilizing the tarot deck as a contemplative practice that I love is the Visio Divina. So can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so I started using tarot in a prayerful way, or using tarot in a way that could be described as Visio Divina, before I actually knew what Visio Divina was. But Visio Divina is a Latin term. It translates to divine seeing. And it's a contemplative prayer practice that involves praying with images. It's similar to Lectio Divina, but I think less well known. And it's traditionally used with religious images, obviously, with religious paintings or icons. But I think it can also be used with tarot. And sort of practically speaking, how I do it, and I think the way it's traditionally done, is that you choose an image, sit with it, and you look at it while you pray. What I usually do is I will draw a tarot card and I will spend 10 minutes sort of praying with the card, looking at the card, praying by quieting my mind as much as I can, which is always an uphill battle,
Mm-hmm.
and spending time in silence, seeing if the Holy Spirit speaks to me through the card. That's how I think of Visio Divina.
No, I mean, I think when I hadn't heard the term, and Lectio Divina, if somebody doesn't know what that is doing contemplative reading and staying with a small passage in the Bible or another religious text and letting it sort of permeate your being for a moment or two and seeing what bubbles up. And I immediately thought of iconography. That is, how we pray with icons is to look at them. But I also thought about how it's a practice that cultivates holy seeing or gazing in a way that sometimes we do. It certainly makes me think when you talk about being a mom, when we have young children and infants, how often have you like gazed at them and you are speechless?
Oh my gosh, all the time.
Right.
All the time.
And you just look and you're amazed at these little face and those fingers and the feet, and it takes your breath away. And so I think that that's a contemplative practices. My understanding is it's not just about some sort of moment of clarity or insight that happens while you're praying. It's actually more about cultivating a contemplative nature outside of when you're praying.
For sure. And I think tarot is great at that. I mean, for me in my own practice, I feel like using tarot to practice Visio Divina, training myself to look at the images of the tarot in a contemplative way has helped me to look at everything in my life in a more contemplative way. I usually pull cards like in the morning before I start my day, before everybody else wakes up. And for me, starting the day in that way helps me to continue that contemplative thinking through my entire day. I think all the time about the line in the Bible about praying without ceasing. I feel like that's a big thing in my spiritual life. It's always trying to figure out what that means and how to do that. And I think tarot is one of the things that helps me to do that.
Can you just say a little bit about what it means to pull a card? If somebody's sitting there being like, I've never even seen a tarot deck and I have no idea what to do this. Is this like a Ouija board or what happens? So can you just explain?
So yeah, tarot is like it's like a deck of cards, a set of 78 cards. What I usually do is I will shuffle the deck of cards a few times, and then I will just like take a card from the top. Usually I pull just one card, but you could definitely pull more than one. One of the really beautiful things about tarot is that all of the 78 images, I think, are interconnected and they play off each other in really lovely ways. But I usually don't have enough time for that. And I like to keep things simple. So usually I'll just take one card and sort of spend 5 or 10 minutes looking at it, thinking about it, seeing what details of the image sort of pop out for me that day. And then I will do my morning prayer. I'm not Episcopal anymore, but I love the Book of Common Prayer, and I really often still pray. I still pray morning prayer from the Book of Common Prayer because I just think it's beautiful. I think it's one of the greatest gifts of Christianity is the Book of Common Prayer. And what I'll do is I'll pray morning prayer, and I'll spend some time thinking about the tarot card I pulled and how it might relate to any of the Psalms or the prayers or the Bible passages that I read that day in morning prayer. And sometimes there are great connections and sometimes it seems like they don't connect. But I always think it's interesting to think about it and to sort of look at my prayer through the lens of whatever tarot card I pull that day. It's just another layer of interesting things to think about and pray about.
You're really beautifully, I think, describing prayer without ceasing in a way that's simple. It doesn't require like a lot of, preparatory work beforehand. It's just sort of making a choice to pay attention in a particular way after being prompted by something to
Yeah.
carry with you for the day.
Yeah. I think that paying attention is such a big part of it. I think for me, it's very easy for me to not live my life in the present moment. And I think this idea of praying without ceasing, a lot of it is just about paying attention. For me, it's very easy for me to think in the past or always look ahead to like what's happening later in the day or later in the week. And especially because I'm a mom, I feel like I'm always like planning ahead and thinking about what I need to do next.
Yep.
For me, tarot really helps me to stay right where I am, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And it draws me back to what I started with, what you wrote about. It enabled you to feel seen. And it's a really curious paradox to me. We want to be seen for who we are. And that starts with taking time to see into ourselves.
Oh, for sure. I completely agree.
And I think some of us want God, want some affirmation from a higher power that we are what we see when we look into ourselves, and that God sees that and beholds it with incredible love and care. And, utilizing tarot in that way, those sort of archetypal images, ways in which we can think about parts and pieces of ourselves and our internal landscape, I just think is also just a real gift of that's lasted for centuries.
I agree. That's a beautiful way to think about it.
Well, thank you. And I want to really thank you for making time to be in conversation with me. I hope people who are curious, I'm going to have all your info in my show notes, but you have a website.
It's just brittanymuller.com.
Great.
Super easy to remember.
Excellent. I'll have all this. I hope people who are curious check you out, check out your book, maybe go and buy a little tarot deck and see what it's like.
For sure.
And you know what? Sometimes in religion and faith and that stuff, it's fun to feel a little heretical.
It is. I mean, I think it can give you a little like spark of excitement.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a little energy. And you know what? I tell people, we don't need to defend God. God's good.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I tell people that all the time. Like, you don't need to defend God. Like, it'll be okay.
It will. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know, I look forward to paths crossing perhaps at another time.
For sure. Yeah. This has been a really fun conversation.
Awesome. Take care.
You too.